I recall too that you said almost 20 years ago you were interviewed by a magazine, kind of this rag mag called City Pages, and that it was a highly altered version of the actual interview.
Yeah.
Was the Gallery 7 did have most of the it's a much more favorable portrait of you, but did it have most of the essential footage? Because you said in the City Pages interview, whole sections where you're analyzing your own poems are completely taken out.
Well, yeah, I was told this by the City Pages thing is interesting because the guy who did it is a guy named Brad Zeller. He owned a bookstore back in the late 90s, and I would go to that bookstore every so often looking through the poems mostly, and we would talk about poetry, and he was impressed with my knowledge. I gave him some poems. He was blown away by my poetry, and he's the one who suggested interviewing me to do like just a little short story. It eventually turned out to be the cover story. It's supposed to be in a pull-out section about the local art scene. Something happened, it became a cover story. But I had ripped into several people there. I think I talk about this David Moore and Julie Caniglia incident in one of them, which was, I think, this Julie Caniglia wrote for City Pages. And so she was there. She was there, and there was this guy named Eric Lorberer, whose nickname was Oreo Boy, because there was one time at a poetry reading, he stuffed his face with Oreos and was drinking milk, and he spilled it all over himself. So I dubbed him Oreo Boy. And so people like that. There was a woman named Joanna Rawson, Josie Rawson, who wrote for it. She was a bad writer. She had a book from the University of Pittsburgh Press, and a handful of other people. They were just utter and total hacks with no talent. These groups, the Loft and SASE, I mentioned them, and they just had nothing going for them. But this Zeller, he actually was a fan of this writer Paul Metcalf, who was, I think, the great-grandson or the great-grandnephew of Herman Melville. But he said that Metcalf would take sections from different things, make collages and whatnot. But his own writing was not particularly interesting. He had interesting ideas. He just didn't have the skill writing-wise to pull it off the way I do in my poems and now in prose works. And Zeller decided he wanted to interview me, and he had me analyze poems. I think I gave him about a dozen poems. They only used two great sonnets, which a lot of these morons couldn't do. That David Moore was interviewed for that piece. He didn't even want to talk about poetry because these people, they're not artists. They don't want to talk about art. I was looking up David Moore, in fact, just after I got this stuff from Dylan, and he's still writing crap about being victimized as a Japanese, as a 3 or 4 year old in internment camps or what. No, he wasn't even born during that. His parents were in the internment camps. All of this stuff. Oh, I write from the point of a sensei, a third-generation Japanese American. Who gives a fuck? You know, I'm a third-generation Norwegian, a third-generation Russian, and a third-generation German. I don't give a shit that my forebears were Nazis, communists, and Vikings. It has no bearing on myself. Much more relevant to me is living in Texas here in the 21st century. But these people, and we've talked about identity art before. They can't get over it. But anyway, getting back to the City Pages, there was what Zeller told me, that he had written a different piece. They kept about 40% of what he had written throughout the other 60%, where he was saying why the poems were great, like this Chin Kid, or why these were good. He was comparing me to this Metcalf. They threw that out, and they told him to go interview people like this David Moore and some of these other people, because they didn't want to talk about art. They just wanted to, oh, here's this angry poet and whatnot, rather than here's this great poet and why not. And you even, if you can find the actual comments from the original story, there were like 30-something comments. Even there, some of these idiots that write in, you can look at those two sonnets and they're, oh, those sonnets aren't much. It's like they're both, this Jenny at 5 at her telescope and Midnight at a White Castle in Bloomington, Minnesota. These are, especially the White Castle one, this is one of probably the top 10 or 12 sonnets ever written. And the Jenny at 5 is again, a deeply moving portrait of a child that's dying. And greatly written. But these people, they don't want to talk about art. They didn't want to talk about it then. And so Zeller had to do that. And Zeller said that then he interviewed all these other people, and they still edited it down to make it more negative. And he sort of repudiated the story. He told, I think he said for about 2 years, that a few years later I talked to him, he said for about 2 years after, he didn't want to write for City Pages anymore because he was angry at what they had done to it. And not only that, he gave me the name, I forget now but her name, but he gave me the name of the woman who was in charge of the letters to the editor section for that City Pages. And I emailed her, and she told me then that she had, that out of like, there was something like 6 or 7 positive on me, five this way or that way, and then there were like, I don't know, 12 or 15 what you call negative or whatnot, which was totally skewed because she said that they published every negative comment, every negative letter they published. They got something like 150 actual letters or emails. You're still getting letters back then. 150 of them, they published the 10 or 12 negative ones, made it look like there's about 2 to 1 negative against me, when in reality it was about 95% positive. And that woman said too, that was one of the things that made her quit. And I can't remember her name because it's now 18 years since that was up. But that shows you, as much as Donald Trump is an asshole, the media has always made up things. They have always made false facts. That's a perfect example where the vast majority of readers, it got more letters from what I remember, that by the year 2000, there may have been a stories since in the last 2 decades since that have gotten generated more press, but that one got more responses than any other article they had ever written to that time, and it was 95% favorable. They made it look the exact opposite, and it's a shame because if you look back historically, and someone in 50 years, when everyone here involved is dead, they're going to say, what the fuck was that? I mean, you published 2 great poems in there, and, well, I've just said it, so...